Win's eyes were focused straight ahead, her heels striking the floor with determined rhythm as she ignored the steady footsteps behind her. She was furious, and she intended to make sure he knew it. Her boss, Jeon Jungkook, Seoul's feared mafia boss of business, was following her down the corridor with an apologetic look in his eyes and a carefully folded letter in his hand. Just hours before, he had humiliated her in the boardroom in front of every executive. He'd torn apart her proposal, scoffing at her ideas with sharp words and sharper looks. She'd held it together in the moment, maintaining a composed facade, but inside, she'd felt shattered. She'd poured her heart into that proposal, and worse, she'd thought he'd trust her enough to hear her out. But he'd chosen to silence her voice instead. Now, as he kept pace behind her, she could feel the tension between them like an electric charge in the air. She refused to turn back, refused to even acknowledge his presence. After what he'd done, she wanted him to know what it felt like to be ignored. His voice broke the silence, softer than usual. She kept walking. A beat passed. He took a shaky breath. "In, wait." She clenched her jaw, her resolve hardening. She wouldn't give in. Not this time. They reached her office, and she opened the door, stepping inside and letting it close in his face. She heard him hesitate on the other side before he finally pushed the door open and stepped in. She could feel his gaze on her as she turned to her desk, pretending to shuffle through her notes. "Yin," he said, voice strained with something unfamiliar, an apology on the tip of his tongue, perhaps. "I need to talk to you." "Is it work-related, sir?" she replied, keeping her voice neutral, not even looking up. She knew that calling him sir again was a slap in the face for him. He always insisted on first names in private. Jungkook's jaw tightened. He took a step closer, the letter crinkling slightly in his hand. "I overreacted in the meeting." He forced the words out, each one sounding awkward and out of place, as if apologies were foreign territory for him. "I should have listened to you." The admission was clearly a struggle for him. Yin paused, her eyes on the scattered papers on her desk. She didn't trust herself to look at him yet. When she didn't respond, Jungkook's frustration slipped through the cracks. He dropped the letter on her desk, his voice sharper now. "Are you just going to ignore me?" Her gaze finally met his, her expression icy. "Ignore you? You mean the way you ignored my work and my ideas in front of everyone?" She watched him flinch, and for a second, she felt a flicker of satisfaction. Look," he started, swallowing the edge in his tone as he struggled to stay composed. "I was under pressure. It wasn't fair to you, and I shouldn't have said what I did." She raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms. "Is that all?" Her voice was cool, indifferent, each word calculated. Jungkook's grip tightened on the back of the chair in front of him, his knuckles white. In's unwavering gaze was getting to him, unraveling his practiced control. But he held himself back, taking a deep breath before he spoke again. "It's not easy for me to admit this, Yin. I know I went too far," he said, his voice lowering. "I trust you, more than I let on in that meeting." She looked away, her heart conflicted between her wounded pride and the sincerity in his tone. "That trust didn't show. It was humiliating, Jungkook. Everyone heard you." A flash of regret crossed his face, his usually confident eyes softening. He looked down at the apology letter he'd placed on her desk, almost as if hoping it could express what his words couldn't. "I want to make this right," he whispered, barely loud enough for her to hear. "If you'll let me." She studied him, her gaze trailing over the once unshakable man now vulnerable and remorseful before her. For a moment, she saw a side of him no one else did, the one behind the iron walls and ruthless reputation. Slowly, she reached out, taking the letter he'd left for her. She unfolded it, eyes skimming over the careful words of apology he'd struggled to write. He watched her, nerves etched on his face, waiting for her reaction. Finally, she folded the letter, looking back up at him. "You hurt me, Jungkook," she said softly, the pain still fresh in her voice. "But maybe I'm willing to give you another chance. Just don't do it again." Relief flooded his face. and he nodded earnestly. I won't, I promise. For the first time that day, In felt her anger begin to melt, though she kept her expression guarded. Good, because next time, I'm not sure an apology letter will be enough. A small smile played on his lips, his eyes meeting hers with a newfound understanding. I'll keep that in mind, he murmured, the tension between them shifting into something warmer, more fragile. As he turned to leave, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of something she hadn't expected, a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, they were turning a corner neither of them had ever seen before.